Warren, I see yourself, Bachhuber, Shaw, Haniro, Urban, Wilkinson, and Potter. We're all here.
Okay, so the first item of business then is approval of minutes from October. We need a motion for that.
So moved.
We have a second.
I'll second.
Jim second it. So all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, minutes are approved. First item of business then is Kiva Sports Complex, the expansion of that. So do we have a presenter for that, Eric?
We don't. I thought we would, but Rob Remaker called this afternoon and said he has a family commitment and he can't make it. So I'll stumble through this. So this is the existing Kiva site, Airport Road, just east of Pleasant View. Big building, one outside soccer field. And the proposal is kind of for the lot next door. They're going to put in a couple more athletic fields, kind of a temporary bathroom building, which the plan is will be swallowed up by a larger building and some additional parking. He's got 2 biofilters planned at each end of the parking lot here. And they're going to fill this site up a little bit too, to think they're just trying to match grade with the existing athletic field up here. So north is to the right on this screen. And they've asked for fees in lieu due to poor soil conditions. You know, there's 2 calculations that were included with the packet. One is for infiltration, the other is for recharge, and we treat those as, you know, what's the worst of the 2. So the poorer performance is with the recharge, and he came up with $8,000 and some for that. This plan it's still in flux, but I thought it would be wise to bring it to you guys now with potentially no meeting in December, just to try to keep it moving along. So I can answer questions. My recommendation was to go ahead and approve it.
They would meet the requirements for infiltration.
They don't need either of them. His infiltration calculation shows he's making about 71% of the requirement. And his recharge calculation shows he's only making about 34% of the requirement. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, in this sense, the word infiltration really means stay on, which includes evapotranspiration, and recharge is what's actually percolating down into the ground. So I know.
So if we approve this, then they still would put those facilities in, right? They just couldn't meet our requirement.
Yeah, and Confluence Pond provides the peak rate control for this area. So, you know, what they're tasked with is just infiltration and pollutant control, TSS control. So he's meeting that by passing the bulk of the water through 2 biofilters. You know, this is not a very intensely impervious development either. This is a synthetic turf field, and it's got tile under drains. So, you know, there is some discussion about how these facilities are treated. And we've been talking about that with the county. But it's not really impervious necessarily. So he does have future building included in his calcs and this parking lot, and the athletic field. And he's meeting the TSS requirement, but not infiltration or recharge.
And the problem with the site is it's high groundwater mainly?
Yeah. Which is not surprising in this area.
Right.
Yeah, I sent out a couple emails today, and it probably isn't relevant to this case, but we have to start thinking about high water tables. And I think we need to have a specific ordinance that deals with evapotranspiration. And this is obviously something for the future. It's not, I wouldn't use it, I don't think it necessarily has anything to do with, deciding here, but it did ring a bell for me that, high groundwater is increasing all over the county. We're not as aware of it because a lot of it is in parts of the county that are not, don't have a whole lot of development, but if we could put that on the table for something, a future discussion, or whether we want to have a specific meeting on that, but I think we need to come up with some kind of modification that deals with evapotranspiration.
I like
Yeah,
that
Ken, I
idea.
started looking at our ordinance and making some recommendations for volume control, which is evapotranspiration. And I got some rough wording down, and if I get some more along, I'll pass it on to you and let you look at it.
Okay.
That would be revising our present ordinance. You're talking about a separate ordinance?
I don't know how we want to do it, but I think we have to worry about rising groundwater before we start having some big issues. And so, back when we put all this in years ago, we never even considered the possibility that, groundwater could rise to the surface in some places. And now we know it can. And so I think we're going to have to emphasize ET more.
Yeah, just for
No
that
ET
and for
here,
volume.
because this whole field is going to be turf, right? So it's too bad it's not grass. You're not going to get any ET off that surface.
No,
You get some E.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
Ken, are there any tools, any models that have been
No, I
developed?
think I don't know that there are. That's something we're going to have to come up with, or some, how we're going to quantify this. But I think we got to do this sooner than later, because there's all around the state, there are problems now with high groundwater. And it's one of those things that it's so different than flooding on Lake Mendota, changes every year, but boy, once groundwater gets high, it's really hard to do anything about it.
I have a question for Eric. So Eric, the $8,500, that's a one-time payment?
Yep.
And what do we do with that? How does that help us?
Well, I think the answer is not much so far, Lisa. We've been collecting fees in lieu for, and Warren, maybe a couple of decades at least, I would say.
yeah, probably mid-90s.
And there's don't quote me on this. I think there's $300,000 or $400,000 available for us to eventually identify a project. These fees in lieu in the past had been accepted for all kinds of things, including rate control and TSS. But that's no longer allowed. So and this is kind of the only thing that's weird or different about the Middleton ordinance now, is that, these are for sites that are exempted from infiltration requirements by the state and the county. And it's unwise to infiltrate here And so we're just, it's kind of a penalty almost of, well, we understand you can't do it, but we want you to contribute to a future project somewhere else. A
I
large
think
scale.
we've used it for several projects and some studies also in the past.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
correct me.
how often, I'm sorry, if I could just finish this
Yeah.
train of thought, Jim, how often is that fee adjusted?
It was looked at a few years ago, maybe a year or two before I came on board, and it was changed, but not significantly. Dollars per square foot wise anyways.
Developers get a little break because they don't have to do a maintenance inspection like other ones have to do.
Well, in this case, he still would.
Well, that's right. He still would. Yeah, you're right.
But I think Eric Thompson did a pretty complicated analysis for you guys a few years ago, and trying to involve getting prices from developers of what did this facility cost, and how much. So the intent was that the fees in lieu would balance those costs, and I think it's relatively close to that. So they're paying a fee in lieu roughly equivalent to the construction costs for the facility they would need if they could build it.
And just to follow up on Lisa's question, I mean, tell me if I'm right or wrong here, if anybody remembers, I think that money was used, some of that money was used back, we're talking 15 years ago now, for some infiltration practices like at the high school tennis court. I think that might have been constructed with some of that fund.
Yeah.
So the idea was to find infiltration somewhere else to offset this, but as Ken says, now we're fighting the high groundwater issue. It's just a good idea still, Are they going to purchase this land to the east? Is that where the new field's going, or do they already own it?
I think they already own it.
It's an empty lot right now.
I mean, recently. Yeah, there was a farmstead there, and the foundation elements of the old farmstead are still sitting there.
Yeah.
Well, if there's
Eric?
no other further discussion, we need a motion for approval.
Well, I did have a couple of questions on page
Okay.
13, Eric, if you could go to that page.
Details?
Yep, so number 5 on this page, it mentions the Village of Cottage Grove ordinances. I believe that should be City of Middleton.
Good catch.
Also, that website, it's not a link, but I think I copied it correctly and it doesn't turn anything up. I need to fix that website. And
Great.
then there's a mention of inspections. Number 3, all erosion control measures and structures serving the site must be inspected at least weekly, or within 24 hours of the time 0.5 inches of rain is produced. Who's responsible for that, and how can the city verify that that's happening?
That is a standard requirement of a DNR, construction site disturbance permit. The contractor is usually responsible for that. This is something that we also pay Dane County staff to do for the city of Middleton. And
Okay.
Casey Coconati comes up at least once a week and does construction site inspections for us. She's really doing like a quality assurance check. Contractors supposed to be doing their own checks and maintaining records of those inspections, and just it's kind of like they're supposed to post the permit on site. They're supposed to have all this information on site and available, including records of inspections. So I mean, you can tell, Lisa, that this is a boilerplate
Yeah.
set of notes. But that's where it comes from.
Okay.
in
Yeah,
our
and I had
51.
I had a similar question about item number 9, where it talks about for the first 6 weeks after the initial stabilization of a disturbed area, watering shall be performed, in dry conditions. I was wondering about that. And then finally, the dates, the time schedule, are those don't look correct. Should the 5/15/22 be 23?
That's not applicable. He probably meant 23 and we're past 10/15. So
Yep.
yeah, you're right on all these things.
So I like the idea of getting those comments back to the submitter, just to let them know we're actually, Lisa is actually reading these things and catching them. So that's a good message to send back.
We will
That's
send it
good.
back for sure. They may have, and I don't know, Lisa, if you were, the specific implementation plan for this site was just approved by Plan Commission, contingent on engineering approval of the plans and a whole host of other things. I can't tell you if we made these specific comments, but they do have a set of commented plans, which they haven't yet revised.
Okay, that's good to know.
Any more questions? If not, does someone like to make a motion? The staff recommends approval of fees in lieu of for the,
Also move.
Well, with a final amount to be determined after all the design details get worked through. Warren,
okay, right,
And it's fees in lieu for recharge, the 8,000.
Both.
it would be so far unless the design changes slightly, but I would assume that's gonna be his bigger issue. Yeah,
Okay,
okay, is there a second?
I'll second that motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second, so all in favor of approval?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion is carried. Next item of business then is Pheasant Branch flood storage and mitigation modeling by Steve.
whoops. I'm on the wrong page, sorry.
There you go.
Steve Gaffield with EOR is here to talk about some additional modeling you recommended in June, I believe.
Good evening.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, everybody.
And Steve, I think, I'm not sure how your slide show is structured, but maybe a brief overview of the differences between unsteady and steady modeling would be appropriate.
Yeah, it would. Is there any kind of intro you want to do here, Eric? Otherwise, I can talk through that a bit.
I think you can probably do a better job with it.
Well, we'll see. Feel free to chime in. But so the work we were tasked to do is two main topics. The first one is related to what future floodplain maps might look like, and that's what Eric was just talking about. In looking at, in particular, flood storage districts that may or may not show up on the city's maps, and it's a choice the city can make. It affects what the maps look like, has implications on development, and it's related to how the models are run. The second main topic, a little bit more straightforward, because it's talking about real world situations of, are there physical modifications the city could do to alleviate actual flooding? So the first part of this is all about what are the flood insurance rate maps or the local floodplain zoning maps look like. And then the second one deals with further physical improvements that could be made. So some of you know these things very well, and probably teach me. If some of you may not, so just to try to get everyone on the same page, floodplain maps are state of the art now is to use computer models to simulate rainfall, runoff from the landscape to a creek like Pheasant Branch, and then flow down the creek going through obstructions, bridge openings, spilling out in the floodplain, and hydraulic models are used to look at the flow and what the elevation of the flood is, and therefore what the floodplain boundary is. Traditionally, most floodplain maps, not all, but most, are delineated with what's called a steady flow model. So there's a first step of engineering analysis to look at rainfall, say 100-year rainfall, you got a watershed like Pheasant Branch Creek. How much water, what's the maximum rate that water discharges into the creek in different places. And then that peak flow is put into a hydraulic model of the stream channel and the bridges and the floodplain and run down the stream, but just a steady flow. So it's got that maximum flow, run it all the time and see where the water level pops up. That works just fine, and is the state of the art in many places or state of practice. But there are other places, and Pheasant Branch is a good example. There's all sorts of ponds and other areas where there's a lot of water that gets stored, and much like an engineered detention basin, it slows the water down, it detains some of it, and you have less flow downstream of that storage area or pond. And to simulate that, you need what's called an unsteady flow model, where it actually looks at change in flow over time. So it tracks how much of the runoff is coming in to these storage areas, how do they fill up through a storm event, and what's the release rate downstream. So it's a more nuanced and more realistic approach to modeling. Floodplain maps can be drawn either way, and I guess as we'll get into more detail soon, there's some policy implications depending on which choice the municipality makes to construct maps. There's some different requirements, and one logical. Well, actually, let me pause there for just a second. See if anybody has questions, or Eric, if you have any comments.
Quick question. When the ponds are being modeled in the unsteady flow or unsteady approach, how is the lifespan of that storage considered, right? Because it's filling with sediments over time.
Right. So the model represents, the world and those ponds at one point in time. So you can change that. You could say, well, what if this fills with sediment? We don't have as much storage volume. That can be changed in the computer model, but the model, it's representing, maybe a 1 day or 2 day storm event. It's not simulating what happens over, say, 20 years. The other thing that's worth pointing out is there isn't any flood storage available below the water level of a pond. So in that sense, it doesn't make any difference if the pond is 6 inches deep or 6 feet deep. It certainly makes a difference for water quality and other things, because a 6-inch deep pond isn't going to trap sediment and pollutants the way a 6 foot deep pond would be. But from just a floodwater standpoint, if it's below water, that's already filled up with water and that can't store any more water. So the flood storage that's represented in these floodplain models is all above the normal pool.
Okay, thanks.
Unlike say a water quality model. So it's certainly an important issue, but doesn't usually have an impact on these flood studies.
Steve, from a regulatory point of view, I'm thinking of FEMA and DNR now. You could either model steady or unsteady submittals are acceptable.
That's right. And Eric, this might be a good segue to go to the first slide because it's got a little bit of regulatory information on it. Right. So yeah, so Jim, to answer your question, yeah, it's a municipality's choice. You could model steady, unsteady. You could model every storage area in the watershed or only ones that you think are important. DNR says, you know what, however you want to do it, it's fine, as long as the computer models match the maps. So there's trade-offs that we'll talk about, and as long as you have a consistent approach, it's allowable to treat it differently. So flood storage districts are defined in Wisconsin Administrative Code. They don't show up on FEMA flood insurance rate maps, but it is a zoning overlay that the state of Wisconsin requires in some situations. And so NR 116, which is the floodplain administrative code, defines flood storage areas as areas that store floodwaters and where that's taken into account in reducing the downstream discharge. And on the right is an image from the Yahara Lakes with an example. Here's flood storage districts. You can pull off of DNR's web mapping application on the Yahara Lakes and some of the wetland areas around the lakes. And as you can probably figure, floodwaters that come into the lakes, they fill up the lakes detain those floodwaters, and the Yahara River downstream of the lakes has a reduced discharge thanks to that storage that the lakes provide. The floodplain maps are drawn, representing that reduced flow in the Yahara River downstream of the lakes. In other words, if you ignore that storage, discharge out of the lakes would be much higher, flood elevations would be higher, the floodplain would be mapped wider than it is. And DNR says, sure, Dane County, you can map the Yahara River, accounting for that storage of the lakes, but you got to protect that storage so it doesn't go away. And that's where the second item on the slide comes in terms of development standards. That's the trade-off, is if a municipality is relying on that flood storage to provide a flood reduction benefit, it has to protect that flood storage and keep it from being gradually filled in by development or other activities, because then the maps would no longer be accurate. So the same requirements that a flood fringe zoning district have apply here, buildings above a flood protection elevation, for example. But the additional requirement is compensating for any volume that's lost by fill. So say for a development site that needs to put some fill in a flood storage district, it's allowable, but if and only if the developer can create some additional flood storage on that property or another property by excavating some high ground to create new storage in the same amount that's lost by filling for a development. And some sites that's pretty easy, and many sites that's difficult or impossible to pull off without looking at a different property. So that's really the trade-off, is modeling flood storage gives you a more realistic map. It reduces the extent of flooding shown in the map downstream, but there's strings attached because that flood storage has to be protected through this zoning overlay. So I realize there's a lot of information there, but any questions on that general policy?
Yeah, Steve, I'm going to make a comment. Tell me if I'm on track or not, please. If, some of that storage that we're talking about, the flood storage districts, is occurring in mapped regulated wetlands of some sort. So those areas already have some level of protection and can't be developed under other regulations. It's those areas that have storage and are called flood district storage areas that are on private property and not in a wetland that could be problematic from a municipal point of view if somebody wants to develop that property. right?
Yeah, that's right. Some wetlands can be developed, but I think you've correctly identified the most at-risk flood storage areas. And I think as we look at some specific examples from Pheasant Branch Creek, I think some of these concepts and implications probably be clarified a little bit. So happy to answer other questions, but otherwise we can move forward, Eric, and start looking at South Pond in the first site. Some of you folks weren't on the WRMC in 2020 when we did the floodplain mapping study for the city. Those maps are available. The study report is available. Sure, Eric can provide it. I'm happy to. But for Pheasant Branch Creek, we built a new computer model, drew maps of the 100 and 500 year floodplain using that model and our judgment. And some of that judgment was, where should you account for flood storage? Because the whole model for the watershed was one of these so-called unsteady models. So it looked at and helped identify any place in the watershed where there was storage. So it didn't rely on us determining ahead of time, okay, there's going to be storage here, but not over there. The model simulated storage anywhere where it exists. And then we used our judgment to identify areas that we thought were the most prominent storage areas and had discussions with the WRMC about that. And unsurprisingly, a couple of those areas are South Pond and Esser Pond on the South Fork. One of the questions that Eric tasked us with here is, and this is a big picture question for all the storage areas, is what's the trade-off? What's the benefit that to the city and residents of including the flood storage districts, because they do have these stricter requirements on development? Is the downstream benefit worth it or not? And so for several flood storage areas, we looked at just eliminating them and comparing the maps with and without flood storage. And in the case of South and Esser Ponds, took a more nuanced approach at Eric's request and looked at, well, what if we shrink the flood storage areas? And physically, that sounds like sort of a strange concept. But again, this is about what the floodplain maps look like. And it is DNR policy that they would allow modeling part of a storage area, but not all of it. So that part of that area is protected by this zoning overlay, part of it isn't. That's okay with DNR as long as you're not mapping, assuming that there's storage in the area that you're not including in the flood storage district. So DNR would say, the maps and the models are consistent, you're okay. You could model all the storage, none of it. You could model half of it. So, it's a little bit of a strange exercise, but that's the point, is what's the basis for the floodplain maps? But it's a little bit detached from reality of how much water is actually flowing where. So Eric came up with some concepts for South Pond and Esser Pond, looking at reducing the flood storage district down to city property, or in the case of Esser Pond, also includes DOT right-of-way at the Beltline interchange. So if you just start with South Pond, that red outline, which is from Eric, follows parcels, and everything in that polygon is City of Middleton property. And the blue diagonal hatched area is the original flood storage district in our floodplain model. Obviously, it extends to the west of that red polygon. That's private property. It's the co-op property in several parcels there. So the thought exercises here is, well, what if we didn't put these restrictions on private property and looked at how much does that increase downstream flooding if you don't map with that storage? Same idea with Esser Pond. Eric asked us to look at these 3 different areas. The area around the pond itself, circled in orange, rights of way of John Q. Hammond and Deming Way in yellow, and then that's DOT right of way in purple over at the Beltline. So again, public property. And obviously sort of an awkward layout. Eric, next slide, if there aren't any questions. Okay, let's just focus on South Pond first. What we did is we ran the computer model, just like we mentioned a minute ago. You can adjust and change the storage in the computer model. So we changed it from the actual storage that is really there to only including the storage volume that's inside of the city parcels there. That was a decrease of, let me just check the math here, 25% reduction in storage volume. And then on this table, what we did is we looked at the 100-year flood elevation or discharge at a few key locations. Some of them are shown with the stars here. And the thing to focus on is the far right-hand table, because that just shows the change, impact on flood elevations or discharge. And what this says is this shrinkage of the flood storage district would result in the mapped elevation for South Pond being 3/4 of a foot higher. This change doesn't affect the mapped elevation of Esser Pond, kind of interesting. Similar change just upstream of the railroad culverts. And then when you get across Highway 14 to the north and heading on downstream on the South Fork, this would raise the map flood elevation by about 0.2 of a foot. Again, this is not a real change. The city wouldn't be physically changing anything here, but this would be, what would it do to the maps and the base flood elevations that would trigger flood insurance requirements?
Steve,
Can
this
I
is
interject,
a-
Steve?
Yeah, please do.
But it could eventually be a real change then if we, if the co-op site redeveloped and wanted to lift themselves up out of. the
Yeah.
floodplain.
Yeah. And like I said, risk of making things more complicated, that is a nuance that's worth mentioning. The traditional, so floodplain maps are drawn, say, with a flood fringe area, right? And you can put fill in the flood fringe if it's not a flood storage district. And it doesn't have any impact on the map because that flood fringe wasn't part of it wasn't accounted for in storage. So the discharge, the computation doesn't make any difference if you filled up that flood fringe completely for the maps. In reality, of course, it does, right? You fill up the flood fringe area, part of the floodplain, you've lost that function. In terms of real world flooding, it does have an impact downstream. It just doesn't change the maps with the way they're drawn. And it's really easy to get bollocks up in that, but
Oh, God.
but there's a difference between the maps, does something change the map? And that's what zoning policy is typically based on. And FEMA requirements are based on, because they're running the flood insurance program. But that doesn't mean that there isn't actually any impact across the whole watershed by these individual projects that are approvable based on regulations, but still have a physical change.
And Steve, this is for the 100-year rainfall, which, what is that number today? It changes sometimes.
Let's go back and look at a report. It's 7.7 something, I think, Jim. So, and recall that in this study, we didn't use the NOAA number. We used the rainfall from Daniel Wright's study he did
Right.
for the city,
Okay.
with a slight adjustment, like a few hundredths of a CFS at Warren's suggestion, so that the model matches the USGS's 100-year discharge on Pheasant Branch.
Okay. So it's 7 point something inches of rain in 24 hours, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a very intense distribution. It's the
Right.
MSE4, so very intense rainfall. So it is true, the same amount of rain stretched over a longer time period would be a less intense storm, but this is one of the standards that's used.
I have a question. I'm just trying to wrap my mind around the policy implications of this. So looking at this map, the private properties to the west that would be omitted from this reduced flood storage district. It doesn't mean they're not going to flood. So what does it do for flood insurance if we go with a map that has, you know, I think of gerrymandering, the funny shapes that we have. I'm like, you know, it strikes me as like, we should go with what the physical reality is. But, you know, I'm willing to go with what staff recommends and what the commission agrees to, but I'm just trying to figure out, so those properties west of this polygon, what does it mean for flood insurance if we go with the reduced flood storage district?
Eric, do you want to back up one slide? I think I can explain it from that slide. So all of the blue hatched area would still be the floodplain. In fact, the floodplain would get a little wider if you did this reduction in the flood storage district, because, you know, I said the pond elevation actually went up 0.75 feet in that scenario. So those parcels to the west on the co-op, they would still be in the floodplain. It would be a flood fringe zoning district. So they'd be in the floodplain, they'd have to get flood insurance. They'd be subject to the city's zoning requirements for a flood fringe district. They would just not be subject to the flood storage district requirement. So they could develop, they could place fill to get a building above the flood protection elevation, higher than the 100-year flood elevation. And they could place that fill without having to create additional storage to make up for that someplace else.
Yeah,
Thank you for,
in either case, Lisa, they could redevelop and they would have to lift a new building up above the flood protection elevation. And the difference between the two is that if this were a flood storage district, they would have to provide this compensatory storage.
Right.
And since we're talking about such huge volumes here, you know, effectively, they would have to excavate the east end of their site to a lower elevation, and it would become unusable flood storage, undevelopable. And then the western portion of the site could be raised and redeveloped at some point.
Right. So for those
They-
western, oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to ask, could they do something like acquire property further upstream?
Yeah, to make additional storage.
Mhm.
Yeah, they could. It
Yes.
doesn't have to be on their property.
Within reason.
Yeah. And I guess ultimately that would be DNR's decision. So trade-offs for those parcels would be, they wouldn't be subject to those restrictions of the flood storage district and having to create compensatory storage. On the flip side, their mapped flood elevation would be 3/4 of a foot higher, and more of those parcels would be in the floodplain. And then downstream in the South Fork, the flood elevations would be a little bit higher and the floodplain would be a little bit wider.
Back to Lisa's question on just focusing on the insurance requirements. Under either scenario, it becomes a district, it does not become part of the district. They would still be in need of flood insurance on their property. Am I right?
That's right.
Okay.
Only if their mortgager, you know, if they owned the property outright, nobody can force them to purchase flood insurance.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, FEMA doesn't send the police out saying you don't have flood. I mean, they're not literally required to have flood insurance, but for most practical purposes, you basically are. You know, if you want to get a loan for anything,
Okay.
the lenders are going to require it. But
And then oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve.
no, sorry, I'm just finishing the thought, but I'm done.
Okay, going back to the compensatory storage, and you know, if they're not in the flood storage district, they don't have to provide that compensatory storage. I guess I'm trying to figure out if we're trying to spare property owners the cost of having to do that, or the impact of having to do that. What is the impact on the city and other properties downstream by giving these properties an out.
Okay, and that's where we don't have new maps drawn, but downstream north of Highway 14, we're calculating that this change would raise the flood elevation by about 0.2 of a foot. And, you know, we could look at elevation data and go, okay, does that pull a few additional properties in, or how does that expand the floodplain boundary? But, you know, it's a modest but real change, and the flatter the ground is, the bigger difference 0.2 of a foot makes in where the floodplain line is.
Yeah, because I just want to make sure, I'm all for helping property owners, not placing burdens on property owners, but that also goes for the downstream property owners. I don't want to create an impact on them to spare somebody else.
Perception is, to me, if we were to take away that area from the, as a district, and allow them to fill without compensating for it, and there's more flooding or perceived more flooding down at Costco or wherever down, you know, north of the highway, you know, to me, the city's going to have to do some explaining, I guess, on that decision.
Yeah, I
Well-
think you're right. And, you know, again, this decision wouldn't. No, I was going to say this decision. You're right. Let me just shut up. You know, you are right.
Yeah, that's a concern for the downstream, the people downstream, right? That's a
Right,
negative externality you're imposing on them.
that's right.
That,
That could become a big deal.
Julie, this is kind of the point of this exercise, is to try and figure out what is the impact to the downstream property owner if we make any of these decisions to remove some of these flood storage districts.
And, you know, the real conundrum is, okay, so we say 0.18 feet, and we say, well, that's not that bad. That shouldn't be a big impact. You know, we remap it. It shouldn't be a big problem. But it's not going to matter if there is exacerbated flooding downstream, because all the rainfalls are different. We all know this. There's nothing, you know, it never rains exactly 100-year storm, of course, or any storm. But anyway, it'll be more of a perception issue that
Yeah,
the city would have to address, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you know, this change, it would change the maps, but this change alone wouldn't affect real flooding. But if those parcels did fill to develop and filled up the storage, that would be an actual change in conditions and an actual change in flooding.
Right.
Why should we think that won't happen? That development won't occur?
My guess is it will develop that if we do
Right.
that.
Right, and I guess, yeah, the point of this exercise is you can quantify, well, how much worse would that make flooding downstream if that did happen? Because
Yeah.
this modeling exercise where you take those areas out of the flood storage district, basically what it's doing is it's assuming they're filled up and they're not providing any more storage. And this is what the result would be.
Yeah.
And
And there's no reason to assume there won't be development. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing all kinds of development.
redevelopment, yeah. And you know, any one parcel like this particular one, well, maybe that's not the end of the world, but we're talking a cumulative situation. Are we going to pick and choose which districts must remain, which ones don't have to remain? You know, now you're making decisions that do impact individual property owners and have a cumulative effect.
But a recommendation by the staff is not to reduce that area.
That's correct.
So Lisa, the staff is recommending not to do that.
That's good.
yeah, I
They
think
got
that
wise staff.
it's a bad precedent to do that. So
Yeah, I agree.
Well, you've grasped the key issues here. I think this will make talking through the rest of these areas much easier. Does anyone have more questions on South Pond? Otherwise, we can move on to Esser.
Okay,
Okay, concepts are all the same. Eric, next slide, please. Okay, so this has 3 different areas that we looked at Eric's request for flood storage. And the scenario we ran was removing everything except what's inside of these 3 colored polygons from the flood storage district. And so these model scenarios are these changes for Esser plus the changes you just saw for South Pond. So shrinking the flood storage districts at both ponds at the same time. And just looking at the right-hand column in the table, it's about the same rise in South Pond, just a whisker more. Esser Pond goes up by 0.2 of a foot now in this scenario. And
Steve,
down-
can I interject?
Yeah, please do, Eric.
So the area removed from the storage district in this scenario, is this land wedged in here?
Mhm.
There's a little bit up in this area, and then there's some on the opposite sides of Deming Way and John Q. Hammond's.
Yep. And you can see that more clearly on the, I think, 2
Yeah,
slides.
on the
Yeah.
prior map, it's
Yeah.
it's these areas that Steve has removed
Okay, got it.
right in here.
Yeah.
This got a little convoluted, and I think it's my bad instructions to Steve. So when we're done here, I want him to go ahead and do kind of another scenario here to make clear what we're talking about and what the impact might be. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And go ahead. As you might guess, out of the storage that's left in the areas that we modeled, that purple polygon around Esser Pond itself has most of it. The rights of way don't have nearly as much. They're smaller areas, they're higher elevation, so the water depth is lower. And if you were to remove the rights of way and have the flood storage district just be the circular area around the pond, it would increase flood elevations again, but it would be kind of on the same scale as this increase we're looking at here, the 0.2 of a foot, because actually you'd be removing less storage than we'd already moved by taking out private parcels, if that makes sense. In other words, something like 80% of the storage of these areas that Eric drew is in that central one around the pond.
So if we enacted maps that kept these flood storage districts as they were originally mapped, and it includes areas of the DOT right of way, do we have authority over the DOT right of way that they could not make changes there without making compensatory storage? Does anybody know the answer?
I think the answer is yes, Steve.
I think it is. This is a can of worms, and I don't have good answers for exactly how this would work and what DOT's ability to object to that. But as maps are drawn, there's a public comment period, and I would imagine you would hear comments. But these would be important things to talk about with DNR. Similarly with town of Middleton, because the maps extend outside of the city boundary to the north, and it's done, but there's implications for neighboring government.
Well, that shouldn't be a problem.
Piece of cake.
Town of Springfield, I think.
Yeah. Take that from the minutes. Don't record that.
Okay, Eric, why don't you go to the next slide? This is kind of an academic comparison, but we also looked at what if there's no flood storage, and I think this really illustrates the importance of flood storage and South Pond and Esser Ponds in particular. So here there weren't any games about, well, we'll keep this part of it or that part of it. It's all gone. You're simulating steady flow. You're assuming that storage is all full. And these numbers tell the story about how much benefit those ponds actually provide. You know, South Pond and Esser Pond, the elevations at those ponds would go up 3 to 4+ feet without the storage. You know, discharge at the railroad culverts downstream of South Pond goes up by that something like 40% increase, 500 some CFS greater peak discharge. All the way down to Confluence Pond, we're projecting a foot and a quarter impact on Confluence Pond 100-year stage without that storage. So I think it really shows the benefit that those city projects to create that system of Esser and South Pond has created for the community. And the reason the numbers with the previous scenarios are so much smaller than these impacts is because although the flood storage districts were shrinking in those scenarios we looked at, the vast majority of that flood storage was being preserved in those scenarios.
Yeah, that does a good job of illustrating the benefit of those flood storage areas. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a huge increase.
Yeah, so I mean, you can picture how different the maps would look downstream if you had to base it on those flood elevations.
Yeah.
No, we don't want to do that.
Is this table removing the storage in the existing city facilities? In other words, South Pond and Esser Pond proper?
Yeah, it's assuming the ponds don't exist.
Oh, okay.
Or they're completely full of water, but there's just no storage.
All right.
And in electronically computer world, what it does is you're running a so-called steady discharge. So it's the same peak flow forever. So you could have the Pacific Ocean as your storage area, but if you run enough water through it forever, it's going to fill up and spill out the other side at a constant rate. So the bathtub fills up and the overflow happens, and that's the scenario here. So again, sort of academic, but it's an educational illustration. Okay, Eric, why don't we keep going? Next area we looked at with this question was Confluence Pond. Here the comparison was just looking at the previous modeling, the flood storage in the hatched area you see here versus no storage in Confluence Pond. How much change would that create if you just had no storage at all in the mapping? So next slide, please. So here we looked at 100-year elevations in Confluence Pond and then Pheasant Branch downstream. Some of the bridge crossings you see here. We also looked all the way down to Century Avenue. And just to cut to the chase, ignoring the storage would raise the elevation on the map for Confluence Pond by about 0.6 of a foot. And same thing when you get down into the Pheasant Branch Creek channel downstream. You look at Deming Way, Parmenter, you're still at about a 0.5 foot change in the mapped elevation. And even all the way down the valley to Century Avenue, there'd be about a 0.5 foot impact. And again, that's because increased discharge coming out of Confluence Pond without that storage. And that has effect all the way down the stream. So I think that's what we looked at there. The next storage area that was mapped as you go downstream is at Park Street. So just north of the high school, there's those huge culverts under Park Street and a very tall roadway embankment there. Yep. Provides a lot of storage behind it and reduces the discharge as you get farther downstream on the east side of Park Street. So we looked at what would happen if you ran steady through there. Ken or someone, did you have a question?
That was me clearing my throat, Steve. Sorry.
Okay.
I think, I tacked on excuse me. I tacked on a memorandum to the back of Steve's. And Steve, maybe as we're going through yours, I should just interject with my recommendation.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah.
So for the South Pond area, the recommendation was to leave that storage district in place. For Esser Pond, I'm not so sure. I want to ask Steve to do a little more modeling to flesh this out. But given that there's no change in the elevation increase downstream, it may be a possibility for you guys to consider that we do limit the flood storage district in this case only to this, conservancy land essentially around Esser Pond. And this is nothing you have to decide tonight, but that's kind of the direction I'm headed in, pending a little bit more modeling out of Steve and his team.
And Eric, I should point out, one thing we didn't do in the limited scenarios we ran is we didn't run a what if you reduced storage district at Esser Pond, but not South Pond. So it's possible that scenario, you still would have some downstream impact on the South Fork, and that the changes in South Pond have, overwhelmed whatever the effect of Esser would be. So yeah, I guess you would want to see those results before making a decision on that.
Yeah. And then for Confluence Pond, I recommended we leave this storage district in place. For this area of Park Street, I don't know if it matters too much. One way of looking at this, if we take away the flood storage district, we get a little bit of rise downstream and we get increased flows, but this is all city-owned land, and that could be viewed as a conservative move, with just a little bit more floodplain protection, essentially. I think any work that the city would do in the creek corridor, we're still going to be kind of stuck with these same, we have to prove we're not raising the floodplain, or, get an easement from anybody that we raised it upon. So this is not so consequential either way, I don't think.
But it's true, you could picture a scenario where the city was, say, rebuilding some of the bridges in the conservancy, raising approaches, placing fill, and then needing to scrape someplace along that reach to compensate for that storage if it were a flood storage district. The reason people don't want to have those restrictions on their property, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of leads me to think that we ought to maintain those districts on city property, so we're not perceived to be bending the rules to our favor somehow.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mhm.
That is a good point, Jim.
So
Yeah,
have
just to
looked at-
quantify what Eric just described, upstream of the culverts, getting rid of the storage district would raise flood elevation by 1.5 feet. It's still pushing a foot, up north of the track and the football field. That tapers off as you go upstream, again, on the city property. Downstream, there's the increased discharge, the 200 and some CFS increase. So, 10% increase in flows, peak flows, and about a 0.5 foot rise downstream to Century Avenue. And I know, seems like the most likely place where a private parcel could be affected is right at Century, thinking on the east side. There's a business there, I can't remember what it is. But obviously you would want to look at that and see, is there any private property or other owners that are affected? But for the most part, that change would be on city Middleton property.
The new development at the corner of Branch and Century, we did ask them to dedicate basically the stream banks to us, and this is kind of one of the reasons why, just to control those stream banks and ensure that we're keeping this all in place. So I'm not sure, Steve. I think there are still a couple of parcels where the city does not either have an easement or a outright ownership of the floodplain.
Okay. The last storage area to look at before you get your fill of storage areas is the airport. The North Fork comes in under the runways on the west side, right where Eric's pointing, and backs up, creates some flood storage there in the low area. And then there's a tributary that comes in from the north, yeah, right there, from one of the valleys on the east end of the runway, the airport property, and then it crosses underneath Airport Road on in a big box culvert and then goes down Nursery Drive. Those are both in the model. You might recall in the big 2018 flood, those areas were combined and flow went around the north end of the airport and down the east end of the runways and over Airport Road and down Nursery Drive and kind of through the whole Kiva area. So even like in the 500-year event, those flood storage areas are combined into a single one. But the 100-year, our calculations anyway are showing that they're separate. We looked at those as one unit. We didn't separate out, taking out one and not the other, but we did look at what happens if those storage areas are removed. On the North Fork over on the west end of the airport, it's a more modest effect. It's about a half a foot change upstream. That suggests that those culverts under the runways have quite a bit of capacity, so the water doesn't back up as much, even if you assume it's a uniform flow going on forever. Downstream, where the lower star is on the North Fork, it's more like a couple of tenths of a foot increase in the 100-year flood elevation, and flows go up by 5 to 7%, something like that. With the scenario of Confluence Pond, in combination, it's more than a foot of impact, similar to what we were looking at over on South Pond and Esser if you got rid of that storage area. Where there's really the most significant local impact is over on the east end of the airport. And that's this tributary that crosses under Airport Road and then follows Nursery Drive to the south. And the reason that shows up as 4.5 feet of change in the mapped elevation is it's the capacity of the culvert under Airport Road. So this is a situation where if you had to map it, if you wanted to map it as steady flow and not have flood storage, you'd have a big peak discharge coming out of the tributary valley and steady flow goes on forever. So it completely fills up that low spot. The culvert under Airport Road can't keep up. So it would be modeled as overtopping Airport Road. And that's what sets that 4.5 foot rise elevation. And then the increased discharge would lead to a higher mapped flood elevation and broader floodplain as you head south toward Confluence Pond along Nursery Drive. But that east end of the airport is really kind of where the most extreme effect on the maps would be.
That's pretty huge.
Yeah, we really looked at that, and Eric looked at that closely, but that's one of the drawbacks of steady flow modeling is you just completely fill up that storage area, and if the culvert can't pass that much water, even with 5 feet of head on it, the water keeps going up until it spills over someplace else, and in this case, that's Airport Road.
Mhm.
So staff's recommendation here is to leave this flood storage district in effect, in place, or put it in effect, I guess.
Are those polygons that we saw to the north and northeast of the airport all within the city of Middleton's municipal boundary? Yeah.
I can't remember. I can't remember if they're all on the airport property, if that helps.
These are, but in your original, Steve, you do have flood storage up farther north,
That is true.
That's
Yeah.
right.
and quite a bit of it, as I remember. And that's
Yeah,
what
on Schneider Road.
Steve was getting at earlier. can we enact a storage district outside of our jurisdiction? That's a question that eventually needs to get answered.
Just out of curiosity, did the Water Resources Management Commission review, were you all involved in the airport master planning process? Or asked to consult? Because I'm looking at the map, the layout plan, and in the tributary storage area, that's where, if there is future hangar development, that's right where it is.
I don't think we were ever involved or asked our opinion.
Okay. Just something to be mindful, for the
Surprisingly,
city to be mindful of, not this
Yeah.
commission.
And staff has had a lot of discussions about that very thing, Lisa. So like Mark Opitz is aware of what's going on here, and I think even back in the early 2000s, when the airport was redeveloped, this was identified as an important to maintain some flood storage up there, even though we weren't talking about formally mapping it. It has been considered.
And this might be a situation where it actually be preferable for the airport to have it mapped as flood storage district. And I can't put words in their mouth, but they'd have the compensatory storage requirement. But as you go north to higher ground, it looks like there'd be room to sculpt those hillsides to create it. The alternative would be have the floodplain elevation be 4.5 feet higher, and all the implications on flood proofing buildings. So that certainly warrants more thought, but I think that's a possible trade-off.
If we get to the point where these districts are in place and we've got these mapped like this, and a piece of property wants to come in and do something that would take away some of this storage, it's not the polygon shape. It's this gets converted to a volume, right? And you just say, okay,
Yeah.
you've got 100 cubic, or 100 acre feet of water storage. You got to maintain 100 acre feet no matter where you find it, whatever shape and
Yeah. Say if you want to place 1,000 cubic yards of fill, you've got to excavate 1,000 cubic yards, that are going to provide flood storage.
Right.
Yeah, as long as you don't hit the water table.
Right. So it's got to be above that high water table.
And not on
It
the
has to be below the
hilltop
flood
either.
elevation. You can't go to the top of the nearest hill and
Right.
dig down the hill. It doesn't make any difference for the water.
Right.
But it's a good point. As the water table goes up, it gets harder to do that. That it's explicitly in the code. You excavating below the water table doesn't count because it's already full of water. Although it doesn't define how you set the water table elevation. Flood storage. Okay, we talked about that. I think that's it for flood storage. We've got the conclusions. I don't think we need to read through them again, but here's the recap. Eric, I guess you've given your recommendation. Happy to answer questions or if you've got them. But this is the end of part one.
Yeah.
Are there other flood storage areas south of the area you showed at South Pond and Esser that we didn't see tonight?
No.
Okay. And yeah, this is only, just keep in mind, we're only talking about the Pheasant Branch watershed here. There's other parts of the city that we've not done this kind of mapping on or flood analysis on. Right? So this would only apply to this one watershed.
Well, it's most of the city, really. Not really, not Graber Pond.
Not Bishop's
Not-
Bay, not anything east of Allen Boulevard, basically, right?
Not the watershed that goes directly to Mendota.
Right.
And not Black Earth Creek, but
Yeah.
I think the county is taking care of that for us. With the new Lake Middleton, North 14 there.
So we're not looking for a recommendation right now, so we should go to the second part of your study then.
Yes, I think so.
All right, this hopefully will be more straightforward because now we're putting the maps aside, say never mind the maps. Are there opportunities to make some physical improvements to alleviate flooding? And eventually that would be reflected in the maps presumably, but this is more straightforward of looking at real world conditions, best estimate we've got about what happens in flooding. And several ideas that Eric asked us to evaluate to make some improvements. So these are evaluated using the unsteady model, the original model, which again is our best representation of actual conditions in the watershed. And the first scenario Eric asked us to look at is what if you expanded South Pond and made this area even bigger? And Eric, I don't know, is there any preamble you want to give to this as background?
Yeah, that might be worthwhile. So Steve had looked at a South Pond expansion in the first round of flood mitigation scenarios, but it was a smaller expansion than this. So this is, I thought about this when I realized how much of the co-op site was being taken up by this flood storage district. So if we were to install a flood storage district here and the co-op site wanted to redevelop, they'll have to provide compensatory storage. And let's, for argument's sake, that might end up being about half as much as what's shown by this red line work here. So I haven't, unfortunately, really been able to sit down and talk with the co-op owner about this. I've shared information and that's about as far as it's gone. I actually thought he was going to be sitting in on this meeting, but I don't see that he's here. The city has a utility corridor through here, which is relatively high ground compared to the pond. So there's a lot of moving parts here. I like, Steve can show you what the impacts of this hypothetical are. This would be pretty pricey. So,
Yeah.
and mainly just due to the volume of excavation, it's just massive. So I don't know, maybe $2 million or something like that, not including property acquisition. And this, we need to give the owner an opportunity to weigh in on this too. So I haven't made a recommendation for this. I need to do a little bit more legwork. And Steve, I think you can carry on.
Well, let me just say a comment here that if there's, lots of ifs here, but if this were to move ahead and be implemented, the benefit to the property owner is all the rest of that area to the west may come out of the district, right? And thus he or she could develop that without any compensation requirements. So there's some benefits to the flexibility of the western 2/3 of that property.
Yes.
All right, that's
The concept that Eric came up with for us to evaluate would be starting this cut a foot above the normal pool and then gradually rising to the west at, Eric, I think it was a 0.5% grade, something like that. And then you'd have a steep slope to get up to the existing ground, which is the red lines are cluster of contour lines all so close together. It just looks like the red smudge, but it's creating this sort of rectangular low area, a bench that starts a foot above normal pool and then gradually rises to the west. And it's a 35% increase in the storage of that pond. So it's a sizable increase. Eric, next, please. Okay, so this is similar to what we showed before, but this is looking at, potential improvements in flooding with this project. The biggest benefit is local around South Pond and that co-op property. 0.34 foot reduction in the peak 100-year stage is what we're modeling. This does have some lowering in Esser Pond, not as much, but 1/10 of a foot. Reduces the discharge, a little bit, not as much as I might have thought. And on the north side of the Highway 14, it's about 1/10 of a foot, and about a little more than 1/10 of a foot benefit of lower flood elevation of Confluence Pond. So there is downstream benefit, but the biggest benefit is local. And Jim, as you were, I guess, adding to what you were pointing out, the actual flood elevation on those parcels would be lower too.
It's really not much of a gain.
But yeah, you think about the cost of that, you can look at the benefit.
It was a
Yeah.
little disappointing to me, to be honest, where the scenario where Steve removed 25% of the storage led to 75 hundredths of rise. And here we're expanding the storage by a greater amount, 35% roughly, right, Steve?
Right.
And yet the benefit is half as much.
Right. And Eric, you asked, well, why is that? Is that right? And as we looked at it, it's probably a timing issue. And at least for the event that we analyzed, this sort of hypothetical intense rainfall, this additional storage fills up quite early in the event. So by the time the peak comes through, the storage is full.
Yeah,
And you're not really getting that
Yeah.
benefit. And, we kicked around the idea, theoretically, you could design this thing so that the new storage doesn't start filling up until the water gets higher and it's a little later, and try to optimize it to knock the peak down. But, Eric, you pointed out, well, you're doing that for this sort of hypothetical rainfall distribution,
Yeah, right.
which isn't really a real event.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a fool's errand. But I will say, it would be worth, if you were to spend the money on this, it would sure make sense to optimize that design and look at, at some actual rainfalls and what do you really think
Yeah.
is likely to happen here.
And you're hitting on the struggle I always have when we try to make these decisions with the information we have, is that, just what you said, Steve and Eric, this is one event of one very defined, rainfall depth distribution and everything else. And, and we can't do this, we can't play this game forever. With other scenarios though, rainfall distributions and depths give us different results,
So, it's certainly possible, maybe even likely, that, more typical rainfall pattern, you'd find you get more benefit in terms of reduced flood elevation and peak discharge downstream, but we didn't analyze it. That's just educated guesswork.
Yeah. You can model the rest of your life away. I know that.
Yeah. No, thanks.
Anyway, I struggle making decisions to say, this isn't worth it based on this one synopsis that we've got here.
Yeah. But I think, you could look at the information Eric pointed out, the change in storage the other way with the previous scenario. And so, okay, what's the most you could reasonably expect to get out of this? The simulation saying it's 4 inches. Are you going to get 2 feet of benefit? Almost certainly no. So you can kind of get some idea of what sort of scale are you talking about, and does it seem potentially beneficial enough to pursue or not?
Yeah. And again, that's the nature of this whole of stormwater, as you guys all know this, there's usually not one silver bullet out there that says, here's the answer to all of our problems. It's a cumulative effect of, a lot of management measures.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have enough money coming even close to thinking about this one.
Not without a grant or something, Warren. I
Yeah.
agree. So staff's recommendation here was to let staff do more legwork and come back to you.
Okay,
Okay, getting toward the end, looking at improvement, modifications of Confluence Pond and farther downstream, another request from Eric. You might recall a couple of years ago, the flood scenarios project we worked on with you folks, we looked at lowering the notch of this weir. So in the photograph, there's the outlet weir controlling elevation of Confluence Pond. It's got this triangular notch in the middle of it, and then a overflow horizontal concrete sill on either side. So a couple of years ago, we looked at lowering the notch, but not the rest of the structure. And this time around, Eric asked, what if you drop the whole thing? So keep the shape, drop everything 18 inches. You'd lower the starting elevation of the pond. You'd gain a little bit of the storage that's, would then be dry and available for flood storage. To accommodate that lowering of the weir, you'd have to do a little dredging of the channel downstream. Otherwise, you'd just be burying the thing into the stream bed. So that would be part of the project. As we looked at that, again, these are all 100-year peak stage and discharge results. Lower the Confluence Pond stage by 0.24 feet. For comparison, a couple of years ago, when we just looked at lowering the notch, but not the rest of that structure, it was 0.19 feet. So it does a little better.
Yeah.
Not a lot better. A really minor increase in the discharge out of Confluence Pond. And then you go downstream, looking at hundredths of a foot change. So, and actually it goes up a little bit because, can I explain why? Or is this just model goofiness? Boy, I have to think about this. This, I think, these changes are so small. I think it's something like the flow goes down, the velocity goes down, and actually sometimes you can get very minor elevation increases. And Ken, this is thinking Bernoulli's equation and trade-offs between energy head and elevation head. So sorry for the geek diversion, but these are 1/100th of a foot. You can hardly even see it, so you can calculate it, but it's kind of beyond what's realistic to think you can predict. But essentially, lowers the Confluence Pond stage by 1/4 of a foot and doesn't really have an impact downstream.
Yeah.
In addition to that, Eric asked, well, what if we could improve some of the crossings downstream? And if you look at this flood profile, it's from the 2020 study, it illustrates there's some potential. And so upstream is to the right, downstream is to the left. We've got some of the crossings labeled. There's a ton of vertical exaggeration here. So, it looks like the stream bed is the Alps, but it's just vertical exaggeration. But you can see the weir for Confluence Pond, and then the red circles are at the Demingway Bridge, pedestrian bridge 7, and Parmenter Street. And the various lines, including the dashed lines up at the top, are different event flood profiles. And you can see the water surface drops as it goes through those bridges. So it's saying, well, some of the water is backing up at those bridges, and the upstream elevation is higher than it would be if the bridge wasn't there. So the obvious question is, well, can you do something to pass more water up those bridges and lower flood elevations? Next slide, thanks. And so there's the Demingway Bridge on the top, trails on both sides. I think that's Parmenter on the bottom.
Whoops, sorry.
So we looked at a few kind of big picture concepts in a sort of very cursory way for what could be done. We looked at the bridge plans for some reality check of what could you do without compromising the structure, abutments and footings and things. And the main concepts, you could lower the trails, which would allow more space for water to pass, but also make the trails flood sooner. You could add culverts to pass water around the sides of these structures. It's an expensive project. And then the survey data indicated there's another potential opportunity here. But the survey for the study was done in 2019, and it found pretty significant buildups of sediment underneath those bridges. And yeah, Eric, thanks for pointing that out. That's why the stream bed pops up there in that sort of strange looking way. And again, the vertical exaggeration makes it look silly, but that's actual survey data. Surveyors collected in the stream, since there's sediment built up. We don't know if it's still there, but it was in 2019. So one of the concepts we looked at is, well, what if you just cleaned that sediment out, but didn't modify the structure? And if you go to the next slide, Eric, presenting results in a different way, there's a lot of scenarios here. But there's a big picture. And so this, for starters, is what would these various improvements at bridges plus modifying the confluence pond weir due to the confluence pond stage? So all these bars are representing the stage of the pond for the 100-year. And the existing scenario, existing conditions is shown on the left, and then these various things we looked at. And here's lowering the weir is the first bar. There's that 0.24 foot reduction we already mentioned. Then there's several things that all have more or less the same effect, about 0.3 or 0.4 feet. And lowering the bike paths, adding a bypass culvert, dredging out the sediment seem to have very similar effects. And obviously there's different size culverts you could put in, different amounts you could lower the trail. And it was our judgment to say how much, but saying, yeah, it's kind of a horse apiece. You get similar benefit from doing any of those things at any one of those 3 downstream bridges. The last bar is looking at, well, what if you made some kind of improvement at all 3 of those bridges plus the weir? And there you go from 0.4 foot reduction in the pond stage to 0.7. So it's bigger. They don't all add up. You don't get 0.3 or 0.4 for every one of those and add them all up and get more than a foot difference, but you do get 0.7. So again, this is a very high level of conceptual analysis, but I think that the obvious thing to do here is to check and see, are those sediment deposits still there? And if they are there, and if they were a result of a big flood, and you wouldn't expect that they just keep coming back over and over, you could potentially get significant benefit from removing that sediment, comparable to what you might get with an extremely expensive construction project, let's say a bypass culvert. It's possible the sediment's flushed out already. It's possible you could remove it and it would keep coming back. And I guess I'd be curious if there's any institutional knowledge at the city to know, have you seen those deposits there? Are you aware of them? Is this something new that happened after the 2018 flood and, might not come back quickly if it were removed? I think that would be a follow-up. That would be low-hanging fruit.
Eric,
Go
question,
ahead.
Eric, I assume during the restoration work that we're still undergoing now, but got completed in this area, they were doing some work in the bed as well as the bank of the channels. Is that correct?
I don't think there was a lot of bed work going on, no.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is worth investigating though, and I don't know if if these are temporary deposits, let's say, and
Mhm.
Steve, maybe would it be something that was left at the end of the last big storm, but then would be rescoured at the start or during, the next big storm?
Yeah.
And then redeposited perhaps at the tail end of it,
Right. Yeah, I guess I would expect, my guess is that deposits happened in the big flood in 2018. And they're gradually being scoured downstream by smaller events that come through. But, it'd be a fairly simple thing for somebody to check.
Eric or Steve, what's the benefit of lowering the confluence pond by 7/10 of a foot?
lower floodplain adjacent. That's it. And, I suppose it would lower the South Fork as it comes into Confluence Pond for a certain distance upstream.
Yeah,
You're adding storage, right?
Yeah.
I think what Steve's prior work showed was that there's really not enough storage in Confluence to make much of a dent. Am I correct in that, Steve?
Yeah, I guess, the storage district analysis was showing that the Confluence Pond knocks discharge down by about 10% in the 100-year. So it does something, but it's not a massive reduction. So, there's a little more storage, but because the weir is pretty low, and if you lower the whole weir, it overtops more quickly too.
Yeah.
So I think I guess I wouldn't want to overstate the benefit of creating extra storage.
so what would happen to our sediment trapping if we lowered it 7/10 of a foot?
There you go.
Well, we'd have to dredge.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep. There's one more slide with results that are earth shaking for the reach downstream. It's worth a quick look. And then there's one more point to make about more frequent events, Eric. Don't let me forget that. But go to the last graph. Back up one. Yeah. Nope.
There you go.
Yeah, here you go. This is just looking at elevation in Pheasant Branch Creek in the upstream side of Deming Way. Again, 100-year, all the same scenarios. You'll note that any of the individual, lowering the weir, essentially no difference. Any of the individual improvements, the way we model them, around 1/10 of a foot lowering. And if you did improvements at all 3 bridges plus lowering the weir, it's 1/2 foot of relief at Deming Way. So less of a lowering benefit than in the pond, but that's what it is. The point I wanted to mention, and Eric's talked about this with us, is we're focused on the big events. Things you would do to pass more water through these bridges, for instance, would have a effect on a small event like the 5-year or the 2-year event. And but the numbers at my fingertips, and I know Nick Hayden here modeled that and looked at that, and there is an increase downstream in the discharge of the smaller events. And that could be problematic because it tends to lead to more scour, and there's all the restoration work going on in the conservancy downstream. And so, you would certainly want to evaluate those issues. And, as Eric, as you've pointed out, try to design these projects if possible to hold back the big floods, but, to pass more water in the big floods, but to not increase discharge of the smaller events that have a big impact on sediment transport and bank stability. So just another complication that you would want to evaluate before moving ahead. I think that's it, Eric. I don't know if you've got recommendations that you want to follow up with here.
Yeah, so the only thing left unsaid from my standpoint is that I think the Confluence Pond outlet modification still has legs in my eyes. And so there's two things. You know, Steve still has a little bit of money left in his contract, and we kind of set it up that way on purpose, that there could be a little bit of follow-up without asking for an amendment. So I'd like to get a little more analysis, and Steve, correct me if I'm promising things that are making promises you can't keep. A little more analysis around the ESSER scenarios and a little more around these confluence outlet scenarios, try to maximize or optimize that. And then allow staff to look into that South Pond scenario a little bit further, and then come back to you probably in January, or maybe it gets pushed to February. And at that point, ask for I guess final direction on how, on the philosophy we want to use to take this mapping. Come on. Sorry. And then at that point, I guess we would ask Steve for an amendment to actually draw some maps. And then we'd take it to everybody else, legal, council, public lands, et cetera, and try to keep this moving forward.
That sounds like a good plan to me.
So Eric, the only one of the recommendations in your memo that we maybe don't agree with is the one for the Park Street flood storage district. That was the one that Jim brought up, the issue of perception of the city not holding itself to the same standard as others.
Yes, that's what I heard, Lisa.
Would you want the commission members to make a motion on that, Eric, or not?
I don't. Yes,
Well,
yes, I would.
I'm happy to move that the commission accept the staff recommendations in the memo dated November 10th, 2022, with the exception of the removal of the Park Street flood storage district.
I'll
Do we have
second
a
that.
second?
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second, so all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I,
Opposed? So the motion's carried. Is there anything else we should discuss on this, Eric or Steve?
Nothing on my end. You've heard enough from me.
No. Good,
Thank you,
good
Steve.
job. Good job, Steve, in presenting a complex thing so we could understand it.
Yes.
Oh, thanks.
yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks for reading this, thinking it through.
Okay, the next item then is any items to be included in your possible December meeting.
I'll step in here first, Warren.
Okay.
Well, you and Ken talking about infiltration. Do you think by January you guys could assemble a discussion?
Sure.
Yeah, I guess I'll work on I got some wording down on the ordinance and I wouldn't take too much more to at least pass it on to Ken for some additional comments. But
Okay.
somehow I don't get around to things lately, so
Mhm. So
Just
the next,
being a caregiver takes more time than I could possibly imagine, so
Mm.
we'll have to see how it goes. It's getting a little better, so hopefully I can do it.
And so the next scheduled meeting would be the 21st, is that right? Is that what I'm looking at?
Yeah.
Eric, I know you had a question about, will we have a quorum? I'll be here. I'm not traveling for the holidays.
I'll be
I
around.
don't have anything slated yet for a December meeting, for that matter. But yeah, I guess it'd be nice to know ahead of time if we can reach a quorum.
Well, I guess the
If-
only thing that we may need to discuss, and this could possibly take place just through with email it to you, is how the commission feels about resuming in-person meetings or having the hybrid meetings and holding those right now in the small conference room B.
I can tell you in years prior, and I heard David before the meeting say he would like to return to in-person. So I think most are okay with it. And there's a couple who I'm not sure of. So to recap, at council last night, they discussed returning to in-person meetings, and they didn't decide anything, but I think it'll go towards returning to in-person meetings at the start of next year. The conference room that we meet in is rather cramped, especially when consultants show up. So yeah, if anybody has misgivings, they can speak now or contact me individually.
Yeah, I got to think about it myself. I don't know if I could afford to be gone for, especially when we have back-to-back meetings with
Swap.
stormwater utility. If it gets to be 4 hours, which sometimes it has been, I'd have to think about that.
The sticking point too is whether or not a person who's, we could still have a hybrid meeting. And honestly, I would still like to have these over Zoom just so that I have the recording. It makes note taking very easy. That I don't really take notes.
So
But
do you need to find out if that's according to Hoyle or not? Or do you think?
yeah, and I think maybe it could just be city ordinance too, whether or not we would allow a person who's attending virtually to count as a member of the quorum.
Warren, would that help you out?
Yeah, hybrid would help me out, right?
Well, since I'm the one who got mentioned as the one being in favor of getting rid of Zoom, I would like to get rid of it, but if it means not having people attend, I'm fine with continuing with Zoom, as long as we keep everybody together.
Well, let's see what the council comes up with, then we can go
Yeah.
from there.
Yeah.
I still am worried about COVID too, because if I catch it and bring it to my wife,
Oh, yeah.
that would be she wouldn't make it, so.
Yeah, I'm concerned with the COVID issue as well, especially if it's tight quarters.
That room is tight.
It is, it's tight, it's crowded.
And we've had a number of consultants there, plus we've had some general population, occasionally interested people come in too, so.
And there's no option to use any other place, the council chamber, library, or something else?
Well, you guys remember maybe from I guess when I started, IT was trying to get a hold of some better equipment for council chambers so that we could hold the hybrid meetings and the audio would work. And it's, supply chain. They still don't have it. I think the last I heard was February, perhaps, that they'd get that in. Yeah,
Well, they better in the council chamber. It is obviously much larger, and we had some meetings out there.
so maybe an option would be if we could meet together in person. Well, yeah, I don't know if that works either.
Eric, is there any opportunity to move the equipment from the crowded conference room B into council chambers?
I think that was talked about before, Lisa, and there was a reason why that wouldn't work,
Okay.
but I'm not entirely sure.
One other thing, Eric, is for possible mid-December meeting, but later is, this USGS is doing a study for the town of Middleton and doing some water quality around the airport because of fireworks.
Yeah,
And I don't know if they collected any data last year or not, but is that something we'd like to have members look at? If I could contact Todd Stundick and the USGS and see what's available.
well, I was just talking with Todd. And I think that the first year of results are gonna go before the town in the next couple of weeks here. So after that, yeah, we can
Yeah,
talk about it. Maybe that could end up on a December agenda too.
yeah, I think we'd be interested in seeing what they found. If anything. Okay, is there anything else for December's agenda? If not, the meeting's over with.
All right,
Thanks. Have a good Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
thank you all.
Thank you.
I know.
Bye.
All right.
Where is it?